For me, the most interesting aspect of fantasy settings is various different races. While I do devote a lot of time to the so-called class mechanics, spells and templates, the most important part of D&D and other fantasy systems, to me, is races and other creatures. I have seen many people complain about D&D 3.5 having, for example, too many sub-races of elves and dwarves. However, when I was writing up Carolan, my own kitchen sink fantasy setting, I quickly realized that there are actually not enough sub-races, so I had to introduce some of my own. In universe, it just made no sense that, for example, desert dwarves from a desert on one side of the continent to be the same as the desert dwarves from a desert on the opposite side of the continent. That's why I had to introduce the dune dwarves. Generally speaking, I treat most of the sub-races not as actual subspecies, but as cultural and/or ethnical groups. I think that not only is this cultural and racial diversity believable and realistic, but the lack of such diversity is unrealistic. Generally speaking, I treat most of the sub-races not as actual subspecies, but as cultural and/or ethnical groups. They just have different racial templates, and some of the human cultures in my setting also have differences in the templates. This is similar to what Pathfinder does. That system did away with most of the sub-races and introduces customizable racial features that could represent a particular culture or sub-race. The other complaint that I often hear is that this racial variety is not needed. What is the point of having so many different races if they are, for example, simply humans with pointy ears, or short humans with beards and a penchant for mining? Mechanical differences are very minor and inconsequential, and flavor differences are even less pronounced. Everybody roleplays them as humans anyway. I have my thoughts about this as well. First, in D&D, most races are indeed mechanically very similar to one another, and there are reasons for that. Races should be balanced for player characters, and D&D often ignores many features that are outside of its depth of resolution. It's simply not granular enough to support some mechanical differences and downgrades them to flavor information. And if you played D&D 3.5, you probably remember that humans were the best race mechanically, which made other races unattractive. There was also the concept of level adjustment that didn't really work as a balancing mechanism. What I love about GURPS is that characters with different racial templates can coexist organically in the mechanical sense. GURPS also is granular enough to be able to make races feel much more different than just boring characteristic bonus. Of course, sometimes you cannot go without such bonuses, but there is a great potential for more interesting abilities or disadvantages. When adapting D&D races, I try to give something interesting and/or unique to some of the more boring races to spice things up. Second, the fact that players roleplay everyone as humans in most cases is the fault of the players. Sometimes the GM is to blame too. First of all, what does as humans even mean? Human cultures can be wildly different from one another. Even the typical race write-up that you can see in the player's handbook gives you enough information to roleplay a dwarf as a dwarf, and if you read additional material from supplements specifically devoted to races, such as races of stone or races of the wild, you will find much more information that will really make other races feel distinct. If you are refusing to read and still are claiming that there is not enough information to roleplay properly, then the fault is yours and yours alone. On the other hand, sometimes there are situations when you really do not have much to work with. For example, one of the relatively recent releases for D&D 5e, Strixhaven, was advertised to have a new race in all the promotional material, trying to make it a big point of the book. And honestly, I was interested to see the Owlins, because before that, the only owl folk race in D&D was the anthropomorphic owl from Savage Species back in D&D 3.0, and here's what we got in the final product. Imagine making this one of the main selling points of the book, There is literally zero substance here. The book just goes, I guess you're a humanoid owl of whatever size you want with whatever features you want. Who cares about culture, personality and backstory? If I were to guess, this race probably was only taken because it grants flight. This is one of the prime examples of the modern D&D writing. Completely passionless sludge with no substance. This is on par with the typical third-party Pathfinder products in terms of quality, and this is definitely not a compliment. Back in D&D 3.5, third-party releases about races were much more detailed and interesting. But anyway, in such cases you have to work things out with your GM. Think about the cultural traits such a race could have. If you put at least a bit of effort into this, it will pay off both for you and the GM. I promise that you will enjoy the role-playing the character much more. For me personally, this creates a world-building conundrum. As you probably know, I am not a good writer. Most of the time I just steal the good stuff from D&D books. I leave many regional descriptions for my setting intentionally vague, so I can expand on them later, when I actually run a game in said region. The same applies to certain races and cultures. They can be quite bare bones, especially when the original D&D source did not have much in terms of material. The problem is circular. To expand the culture or race that inhabits a certain region, I have to run a game in it, but to make the region appealing for players, I have to expand the cultures and races of that region to make them more interesting. As a GM, to break this cycle, I have only one option: to just sit down and write. Fortunately, GURPS has a long list of advantages and disadvantages that can serve as an inspiration. Also, GURPS Template Toolkit 2 Races, GURPS Space and GURPS Fantasy all have excellent advice for such things. If you design enough racial templates, you will understand that even a simple quirk, perk or a minor disadvantage can shape the culture and personality. For example, the Grey Elves in D&D are one of the very underdeveloped sub-races. They are just normal elves, but even more arrogant, aloof and reclusive. How did I make them different? First, I gave them a penalty to strength, health and a bonus to intelligence, but that's boring. The fun part, in my opinion, is that I decided to give them Slow Healing 1 for -5 points. I believe that this, being a racial trait, would make them much more cautious. Every injury they take would take a long time to heal compared to other races. Coupled with their intelligence bonus, this might result in them being more reclusive, more interested in intellectual pursuits, far from physical dangers. The fact that they have slow healing would also change their perspective on others. Who cares if a human or a non-grey elf gets injured? The wound will heal up in no time. This perspective might make them more arrogant and value the well-being of others much less. I think it makes perfect sense in a fantasy world, and it already gives you much more material to base your role-playing on. As always, I have to tell you not to stick too closely to the source material. Understand that some of the racial traits are not described in D&D only because of the system itself, but in GURPS you're free to create your own content, so do it! Expand, explore and experiment. What was flavorless and bland in D&D can easily be fixed with just a little bit of effort. World building and GMing cannot be done without effort, you have to understand it. But if you love what you're doing, it will not feel like a chore. I'm sorry if this video was a bit directionless, it was mostly a stream of consciousness. I hope I managed to explain to you that many of the gripes people have with D&D races might not be problems at all, might be related to the system itself, can be easily fixed in GURPS, or are the fault of lazy players. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.